Okay. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very honored and thankful for having this opportunity to share with you the results of this important survey. I think this is a particularly important audience as well, because I'm sure that most of you would be interested in this data, but also I hope that you can also make a commitment to work for a change in this situation. And also, as a former student at Poli-Sci and as a former fellow, I am very happy to be here and maybe just to give back to UCSD and to the Baja community what you gave me several years ago. So let me put this over here. So for the following minutes, I will be talking to you, where I will be walking you through the main results of this survey. And it is important to emphasize, as you saw in the previous presentations, that I will be talking about the main results. I cannot go through all the information in 40 minutes, but I hope you can get an idea of the potential of this survey. But before I start with data and with the specificities of this survey, I wanted to talk just a couple of minutes about the topic that this survey aims to measure. Basically, what ENDIREH measures is violence against women. So we have different possibilities to assess this social problem. One is through the information we have with administrative records, administrative data, but we have several problems with that information. The first one is that usually administrative records is information that you can get from different institutions when women approach to those institutions. We are talking here about health institutions, public security institutions, or the Attorney General office. The problem here is that we have a bias. Usually women who approach these institutions are women who actually face a very high level of severity or that are facing a high level of damages or high level of victimization. So we have a bias over here. So that's one on one hand, this is a problem. A second problem is that for countries that have weak institutions, it's very difficult to have good administrative records. This is particularly relevant for Latin America countries. So an alternative is to have specialized or dedicated surveys on violence against women. So if the survey doesn't capture the complete prevalence of violence against women, at least it captures different levels of severity of this violence. That's why even international organizations, United Nations, for instance, have recognized dedicated surveys as the most important instrument to gather information on this problem. They develop, indeed, several guidelines of what methodological aspects these surveys must comply just to gather relevant information, but also information or data with enough quality just to make strong inferences. What I'm showing you in this slide is not only those ethical guidelines and methodological guidelines that have been approved by the World Health Organization and the United Nations, but also the guidelines that ENDIREH follows. And these are, again, ethical guidelines, but also methodological protocols. The first one is that only women interview women. This is not a minor point, and it is not, because it is proved that for this type of experiences, women feel more comfortable talking about them when they speak to other women. So that's why when we hire interviewers, we need to be very careful about the specific aspects of these interviewers. They have to be women, they have to be of certain age, they have to have certain knowledge. No? Yesterday, Graciela was saying that they tend to be psychologists, not all of them, but they have to be knowledgeable about gender issues or specific social sciences. The second point that is important is that we need to have the consent of the selected woman. So we need to develop an environment of trust, an atmosphere of trust, so the woman can speak with those about all those experiences. So that's why we pay a lot of attention to the training of the interviewers. So we spent at ENDIREH almost 2 weeks to train the interviewers. And this training not only incorporates issues about how to implement the questionnaire, but also strategies for developing this environment of trust. So we need to be sure that the woman is trusting us to share the information. So that's why we need the consent of the one that we interview. The third point is that we need to guarantee absolute privacy during the interview. The interview is not conducted if there is a person 4 years or above around the woman that we are talking to. Sometimes it's very difficult to have this privacy environment, so that's why ENDIREH is quite an expensive survey, because most of the time we need to make an appointment. So we knock the door and say, Antonella, here we are coming to interview you, whatever. And then Antonella says, I cannot talk or I cannot speak with you right now. So we make an appointment, and then I can interview Antonella the next day, maybe in her house, maybe at the park, sometimes close to the house, whatever. But we need to have privacy. This is one of the most important points of this type of surveys, because most of the time, or sometimes, the people who are perpetrators of violence live with the woman. So we need to be sure that she feels safe talking with us about these experiences. The fourth point refers to INEGI's women. We hire, as I said, women to interview women, but we cannot assure that the person or the personnel that we hire are not themselves victims of violence, or were not themselves victims of violence. So we need to be sure that they are safe as well when they are interviewing these women. So we develop a whole set of instruments to guarantee the well-being of the interviewers. That's on one hand because we cannot be sure that they are victims of violence by themselves, but on the other hand, because just to listen constantly experiences of violence can develop what is known as the vicarious syndrome vicarious syndrome, which may develop different symptoms, anxiety, etc. You establish an empathy with the victim or with the woman that you're interviewing. So ENDIREH has in the implementation program and in the training as well, a set of recommendations for the interviewees so they can take care of themselves. So again, the sum of these 4 points is what makes ENDIREH one of the most expensive surveys for INEGI. And also, and just keep this in mind, is what makes to conduct this sort of surveys also a political issue, because you need to guarantee enough budget just to take or to implement a survey like this. So we can talk about these 4 points in the Q&A section, but for now, just keep in mind that we need, if you are going to use information on violence against women from surveys, the first thing that you have to check is whether or not they comply with ethical standards, because ethical standards for these types of surveys are also methodological important points. So with these standards, we hire 1,312 interviewers. They spoke with more than 100,000 women across the country. ENDIREH is, to my knowledge, one of the biggest surveys, dedicated and specialized surveys on violence against women. If not the biggest, it's one of the biggest. It has a potential to have national representation, but also a state-level representation, urban and rural representation. It was conducted between October and November of 2021, and it's a conversation that we have with women that are 15 years or older. On average, the interview lasted around 60 minutes. So, but you can, or there were times in which the interview lasted even more than 3 hours. So again, that's why this is one of the most expensive surveys. For those of you that are familiar with the survey design, you know that you have to take a specific idea of how long the questionnaire takes. And in the case of ENDIREH, we cannot have that certainty because sometimes you have a woman that may face different types and levels of victimization, so the survey can get longer and longer. So what does ENDIREH measure? The general goal or objective of the ENDIREH is to generate information on experiences of violence that women aged 15 years and over face. The second point that makes ENDIREH an international reference, not only that it complies with all those methodological and ethical guidelines that I was talking about, but also by the conceptual and thematic coverage. The goal is to have a good assessment of the violence that women face in 5 different types of violence, which is the psychological, the physical violence, the psychological violence, the sexual violence, the economic violence, and the patrimonial violence. And then ENDIREH gathers this information also, or gathers information also about the person who perpetrates the violence. So, and using that information, it classifies the violence in 5 different settings of space. This is like a conceptual issue that I want you to keep in mind. When we are talking about a space, no, we are really referring to the social relationship that is between the woman who faces violence and the person who perpetrates the violence. So for instance, if my husband, my lover, my boyfriend punches me, we are talking about intimate partner violence. If it is my classmate or if it is my teacher, we are talking about school violence. It doesn't matter if it happens in the school, in the park, no, at the beach, whatever. If it is my classmate, we are talking about school violence. If it is my boss, we are talking about work violence. If it is my uncle, my sister, we are talking about family violence. And if it is a person that is not clear, that is not a clear relationship, we are talking about community violence. For instance, a random guy walking down the street. In all dedicated surveys, usually you capture the victimization in 2 time frames. One is during the lifetime, whether or not you face violence during your lifetime, and the second one is whether or not you face violence in the past 12 months, 1 year before the survey is conducted. And I will explain why this is important. The first one is help us to understand the dynamics of violence in general. And the second one, the last 12 months, is usually the most useful for policy purposes because it allows to understand the most recent dynamics of violence. So here, ENDIREH in 2021 and in the previous edition of 2016, captured information about what is known as digital violence. I'm just, I would like to make a reference on digital violence because I'm not going to give you the results on digital violence in this occasion because, as I said, is too much for 40 minutes. But there is an international discussion. We were talking previously about all these international debates, methodological debates, and here we have another methodological debates because digital violence is not really a type of violence, but it's not only, or it's not also a specific space of violence. Somebody can use a device, a cell phone, and post an image of me, and maybe that could be considered sexual violence. If the person who posted the information is my boss, so it's a sexual violence at the work setting. But imagine that a friend of mine that works with me reposts that information. So it's also work violence. But if another friend of mine that doesn't work with me reposts that information, and then we are in another setting. What I'm trying to say is that digital violence has forced the international community to talk about Two things. First, how to define it, because it's not a type of violence, it's not a space. It seems to be that digital violence is more like an instrument to inflict damage or to conduct violence. So at 1 year ago, exactly 1 year ago, there was an international meeting that established that the way we are going to refer to digital violence internationally is technology-facilitated gender violence. And there is a ongoing discussion about what is the best way to measure it internationally. That's why I just put it in another point. So the topics that you see on the screen are another topics that ENDIREH also covers, and this information allows to contextualize the violence that women face during their lifetime and in the past 12 months. So let me now talk about the general results. It's a lot of information. So all the questions that you may have about conceptual and theoretical, we can go to we can just talk about them during the Q&A section. So these are the main results and the most general results of ENDIREH. What we have is that for the last edition, 7 out of 10 women in Mexico have faced an act of violence during their lifetime. 70% of the women. If you see, the most common violence they face is psychological violence. Half of the women in Mexico have faced any act of psychological violence. And please take into account that it's not, for being psychological doesn't mean that it's less important. For instance, you can be stalked, intimidated, etc., by psychological violence. But sometimes this stalking or intimidation may cause even suicidal attempts. So any violence is as important as the rest. The second most common violence women in Mexico face is sexual violence. Half of the women in Mexico has faced at least one act of sexual violence during their lifetime. The same picture, but in the previous 12 months, show that 4 out of 10 women in Mexico have faced an act of violence in the previous 12 months before the conduction of the survey. Of these, the most common is the psychological violence, but here is followed by the sexual violence. And in the third place, economic, patrimonial, in the last place, physical. This starts to talk about the dynamics of violence. When we measure lifespan and the last or the previous 12 months, I wanted to show you this slide. This comes from an analysis in the Asia and the Pacific region. Here is also only intimate partner violence, no? Which is the international indicator that most of the countries look to gather information just to report this indicator. And here what you can see are the two measurements. It's very hard to see, but in the bigger circle, you have the percentage of women who disclose experience of physical or sexual violence or both by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And the smallest one is the same, but for the woman who experienced this type of violence in the past 12 months. If you pay attention to Afghanistan, you can see that in the lifetime, 51% of the women, and in the previous 12 months, it was 46%. And if you check the information, for instance, on Fiji, you see that it goes from 64% to 24%. Anyone an idea of what does these numbers, the comparison between the numbers mean? Why is important?
So it could be that the rate of violence is decreasing in Fiji compared to Afghanistan because probably to public policy programs oriented to, right, to decrease the number of acts of violence against women.
It allows to compare the stability of the phenomena in contrast with changes that you face in recent times. In other words, when you see what happened in Afghanistan versus Fiji, what you can say is that in Afghanistan, violence is more stable than in Fiji. So in Fiji, we are seeing changes in policy, but in the other way around. So we may be changes due to whatever policy or social norms or I don't know. But what you can see is that women in Fiji tend to face less violence more recently than the violence they faced during their lifetime. I don't know if I'm clear with this comparison. That's why we do this, because we need to have numbers in order to analyze how stable the phenomena is. So in Asia and the Pacific region, you can see that there is a lot of stability in violence. So comparison with numbers closer to us. This is physical, sexual, or psychological intimate partner violence in the US and in Mexico. Even though that in the US, you have a higher prevalence in lifetime compared to Mexico, what you can also see is that Mexico has more stability in the prevalence of violence. In other words, the number of the women who face violence lifetime is more similar to the number who face violence in the previous 12 months. So what we want to see is a distance between these two numbers to grow during the time. Eu?
Last 12 months and lifetime?
Again, can you ask?
Sorry, yes. I wonder if, because I cannot fully understand what you're trying to say with the USA. So lifetime is almost half,
yes.
And then it's less than 10% last 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you just told us that this is what that is what you want to have, like a big distance between these two circles.
What you want to have is a zero number in general, but what an expectation is to have a big distance between these two circles, because what you will be showing with this distance is that there is a difference, that the pattern of violence is changing along the time. So the violence that women face during their lifetime is different from the violence that women are facing in the closer time in time. I don't know if I'm clear now. Am I? Yes? Okay. So that's why when you compare these two, even if this number is higher for lifetime, these numbers are more stable. This is the last picture that I wanted to show you about the potential of ENDIREH. ENDIREH allows also to identify the correlation that you have between socio-demographic characteristics and prevalence of violence. For instance, here you can see the difference between living in an urban-rural area, the differences that you face according to your age, your level of education, your marital status, and whether or not you consider yourself indigenous people. So here, what you can see is that women who live in an urban setting face more violence than women who live in a rural setting. You can see also that, for instance, women who are younger face more violence than women who are older. You can see also that this may be counterintuitive outcome, but women who have higher levels of education face more violence than women who have less education. And also, women who are single face more violence in comparison to the same group than women who are married or separated. But also, ENDIREH allows to identify what type of violence. So, for instance, women who live in urban areas are more vulnerable to sexual violence. Women who are 65 and over are more vulnerable to psychological violence. And here, I think it's quite important, because one of the facts that ENDIREH have found is that older women tend to face more psychological violence in terms of negligence. And if you consider that we tend, we are becoming older and older, no? And women tend to live longer than men. This is an important issue just to prevent policy interventions. Also, for instance, women who are single, they tend to face more sexual violence than the rest of the types of violence. So this is part of what ENDIREH allows to understand or to infer. Now let me go very quickly to results by setting or by space. In the school. In the school, what we found, and I will be emphasizing the results in the last 12 months because those are the more relevant for policy issues. What we found is that 20.2% of the women who went to school 12 months previous of the conduction of the survey faced some sort of violence. Of these, the most common type of violence was sexual violence, followed by psychological violence. One of the points that is very important is who conducts the violence. And here what we have is that the most common perpetrator of violence is a male classmate, followed by a male teacher. So usually, we tend to think, at least in Mexico, that there is a strong violence between teachers against girls. But really, not only for this survey, but also for other research that in which I participated before, we know that the most violent relationships are among classmates. So this speaks a lot about the necessity to develop protocols, guidelines about how to make the relations and the community socialization at the university level to pay more attention to those issues. And also because most of the acts of violence happen at the school setting. In other words, being in the university requires a specific attention on the protocols, on the policies, just to intervene and trying to develop better relationships among classmates for this type of situations. At the work level, what we have is that 20.8% of the women face some type of violence during the last 12 months. The most common is discrimination, followed by sexual violence again. If we check what were the situations of discrimination, what we found is that the most common is that women have less opportunities than a man to a promotion, or that they get paid less for doing or conducting the same type of work. Who are the perpetrators of violence at the work level? The most common is the coworker, followed by the employer or boss, but pay attention that the third perpetrator most common is a customer. So again, it's not only to develop better policies just to have a better environment of work, but also how to develop instruments to make women to feel secure at the work level when the perpetrator is a customer. These are the places where the violent acts happen. Most of them are at her workplace. Now at the community level. Here, 22.4% of women have faced violence at the community level. And again, the most common type of violence is sexual violence. When we check on perpetrators, we found there is basically a stranger, or no, I have never been able to pronounce that word, but you can see it, no? The second one. It's just out of my reach, that word. But well, thank you. Conocido. And these are the places. Here I just wanted for you to pay attention. The first place is the stripped apart, and the second one is public transportation. When you break the information at the state level, the two states where the levels of violence is the highest is Mexico City and the state of Mexico. And part of the reason is because community level or community violence is very high. When you pay attention to this, a lot of situations happen in public transportation. Women need to commute, do very long commutes in public transportation, and they tend to have several acts of violence during those commutes.
Alexandra, the former one, I see the street playing a very important, but we have very little parks in Mexico. So don't you think
It's a street park. So really what it does, what we are referring to is just an open space, no? More than a Central Park or Balboa Park or something like that. It's an open space.
Hola? Okay, I have a quick question. I realize that you have a private housing unit. It's not that relevant considering or compared to a street or park, but you do have like the most violence. It's happening with their partners at home. So how is that number correlating?
Nothing. Because remember that when we are talking about spaces, what we are referring to is the relationship between the woman and the perpetrator. So it may be somebody that goes to your house to deliver something, you don't know the guy, and no, he is violent with you at your house. No? So family violence is something that I will present in a moment. But that's why I was making an emphasis that is not the physical space, but the relationship that you have with the perpetrator of violence. So that's why here could be the church, your house, the park, whatever, because here we are talking about the relationship between the perpetrator and me. Am I clear? Here's,
Just wait for the family.
Go ahead.
No, but my question was, if it has to do with the relationship with the partner happens in the family unit, right? So how come the number is so low considering?
Because here you are talking about the violence that is perpetrated by somebody you don't know. It only talks
it has nothing
about
to do with the
exactly. So what I have been showing is like where is the violence occurring, but not referring to who is. I mean,
okay.
Yeah?
Got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Just a quick question. Why is there a difference between public transportation and the Metrobus? Isn't it the same?
No, here we are talking, it's because what I was explaining before, because at the Mexico City and the state of Mexico, we have this specific question. Indeed, there was also another one for subway. No? So you can add all of this, no, just to get the whole sense of public transportation, but the bus, minibus, urban pecero, the different ways that you call them in general. For instance, Tijuana doesn't have a subway, and they have a different thousands of names of these little bands that you use and everything. So that's why. And the second one, since it's a state-level representation, this is useful, for instance, for Mexico City or for Jalisco or for Nuevo León, who they have a subway. So if you have that 3.9% are reporting to have been victims of violence in the subway, then you have something to do, no?
I was going to say, Alejandro, that this is something that really, it comes with the territory. If you're from Mexico City, you will understand that in the Metrobus or in the subway, there's some rules that is clearly seen here. So they working because they deterring some of this violence against women. Last time that I was in the Metrobus in Mexico, I didn't know that there's a section for only women downstairs.
And you were kicked out.
And I went there and I said, get out of here. I've been living now in San Diego for quite a long time, and they don't know the rules. But I mean, it's almost 10 points differences. It's a lot.
But these are the national results. If I were present at ENDIREH, the web page, you can find the state-level results. And you can see how these numbers differ. And that's why we included these specificities in the questionnaire. So for policy design, they are relevant. Family, which is what you were talking. At the family level, 11.4% of women, family, this is not intimate partner violence, family level, 11.4% of women have faced an act of violence, of which psychological violence is the most frequent or the most common, followed by economic or patrimonial. Here is what, there is an interesting outcome about the perpetrators. Psychological violence, the most common perpetrator is a brother or a sister, followed by the father. But please pay attention to the physical violence. Again, your brother or your sister tend to be the person who perpetrates violence. But in the second place is the mother. Here we start, when we make an analysis about violence against women, domestic violence and violence against children, what we found is these cycles of violence, this tendency in Latin American countries to have physical punishment as strategies of education. So spanking, yelling, insulting the kids, it's so common. This is why ENDIREH is not only about the violence against women perpetrated by men, but also it's the violence against women perpetrated by any person. Sexual violence, it confirms what we know, that tends to be in the family or within the family by close relatives, a cousin, an uncle, or an aunt. Intimate partner violence, and I don't have the slide, I took the slide out, but the most common place in which this violence occurs is the woman's house or the house of a close relative. Intimate partner, what we found is that 20.7% of women faced intimate partner violence in the past 12 months. Psychological violence was the most common, followed by the economic or patrimonial violence. Here, again, the most common place in which this occurs is the house of the woman. I think that this answers your question or your concern. Here is just a summary of all this information, and I'm going to show you by the highest, the lowest to the highest. Throughout life, the 27.9% face some act of violence in work, 32.3% at school, 39.9% by intimate partner. At the community level, 45.6%. In the past 12 months, 11.4% face violence at the family, 20.2% in the school, 20.7% by intimate partner, 20.8% by work, and 22.4% at the community level. The community seems to be the most dangerous place for women in Mexico during lifetime and in the past 12 months. If you see this picture, maybe too many numbers, this is a summary, etc., but it's also a guideline for policy design. The things that you remember, the circles that we were comparing before, this is why we need them. So there is a lot of, for instance, changing patterns that maybe at the school level. But you know that we need to work more at the community level in order to reduce these prevalences. Now, I keep talking about data. I didn't want it to show you numbers and numbers and numbers because I know it's heavy. So I wanted to finish this presentation with two pictures of what we can understand, or what ENDIREH allows to understand. The first one is about help seeking. What you see on the screen is ENDIREH has several, it's a long questionnaire. And if I'm interviewing you and you tell me that you faced an act of violence, because one thing that I must say is that I'm not asking Marta whether or not she has faced violence in their life. I ask Marta whether or not she has been punched, she has been kicked, she has been insulted. So I'm asking acts. I'm not letting the woman to know whether or not she's facing violence. I'm asking by a specific act, if they face that act. So if the woman tells me that she faced any act, Then I follow a set of questions. The first one is that, did you tell somebody? No. In that question, what we found is that from the 31.7% of women who face violence at the community level to the 44.7% who face violence at the intimate partner level, they didn't tell anyone. They basically spoke about these situations for the first time during the interview. And most likely it was the first time, the only time, and the last time they are going to talk about it. That's why it's so important to have privacy, so important to have consent, so important to develop a trust relationship. Violence is most of the time something that you live in silence. So that's why ENDIREH has also this pedagogical effect. So what happened when they face violence? What you are seeing here is after we ask women whether or not they told somebody, we ask, for those that told somebody, we ask them the person to whom they spoke to. Most of the time it's family member, a religious leader, no? In less occasions are psychologists, lawyers, whatever. And then we ask whether or not they ask for help or they file a complaint. So what you are seeing here are the numbers for women who face sexual or physical violence. It's not any type of violence, it's sexual or physical violence. Of those women, what you can see on the screen is that the majority did not request any sort of assistance or did not file a complaint. So again, this confirms that violence is something that you live alone and in silence. Of those that approach institutions, they went basically to file a complaint, unless to request just assistance. There is a strong policy initiative in Mexico that says that you don't need to file a complaint to receive assistance from institutions. But what ENDIREH is showing is that actually women do not approach institutions asking for help. If they approach, it's because they need to file a complaint, and it's a very small number or percentage of women who actually approaches to file a complaint. So this is another reason why we cannot trust administrative records just to have a good picture of violence against women in Mexico. It's very, very low, the women who approaches institutions. And when I have all these sessions about policy development, etc., and they talk to make easier for women to approach institutions, I always remember this slide and said, I think that we have to develop better ways for institutions to approach women, not for women to approach institutions, because it's not happening. The other thing is that these are high numbers, but it's a general trend. It's a characteristics of facing violence. So why they do not seek help or they do not approach to institutions? If you see these numbers, the most important reason, it doesn't matter who was the perpetrator of violence, is that because they consider that it was a minor matter that didn't affect her. We are asking, for instance, it's just that I have Marta here, but we are asking Marta whether or not she has been punched. And Marta can reply to me that she didn't file a report because she thought it was not important. I'm not requesting Marta to have an idea of how difficult or how important is the act. I'm just asking Marta for facts. So Marta can tell me because I thought it was not important. 43.1% at the school level or in the school who face violence at the school thought it was not important, and that goes to 27.7% for intimate partner violence. For me, one of the reasons that is of concern is fear of consequences or threats. Check for this one. the percentage of women who face intimate partner violence. 22.2% are afraid of the consequences, and that's why they do not approach institutions to file a complaint or to look for assistance. This is the second and last picture that I wanted to present. ENDIREH also allows to know better the dynamics of violence. ENDIREH has another section, which, by the way, is one of the few instruments that we have to approach violence against children. And we ask women whether or not they face violence before 15 years. So the women that we interview, 41.8% faced an act of violence when they were children. Of those, the most common is physical violence. Again, we have this tendency of have a physical punishment as a normal, is quite normalized. But the second one is psychological, and in the third place, sexual violence. Here is what I wanted to show you. Of those women who face violence when they were a child, they face 83.8% of those women face an act of violence during their life as an adult. If we compare that 83.8% with the 60.3% of women who did not experience violence during childhood, we can see that experiencing violence during childhood makes a woman more vulnerable to face violence during adulthood. This situation is more acute when the violence that women face is sexual violence. Compare the 94.6% of women who face sexual violence and face an act of violence during adulthood with a 66.7% of those who did not face. So what ENDIREH allows to understand is how facing violence during childhood increases your likelihood of facing violence during adulthood. But not only that, it increases the likelihood that you become a perpetrator of violence. This is another set of questions that goes to the family of origin, and please pay attention to this one. We ask women whether or not they witness physical violence in the family of origin. Of those who say yes, we ask them whether or not they experience physical violence. And when we ask women whether or not they beat or used to beat her children, the highest percentage of all comes from women who witness and experience physical violence. When you move for the woman who did not witness or experience physical violence, also you have a higher percentage of women who actually beat their children. The lowest is of women who did not witness, did not experience physical violence. So this is part of the reasons why when we speak or when we analyze violence against women, we also have to pay attention to violence, to domestic violence or violence against children. There is a long and strong discussion about several ways to measure violence against children. For instance, since there is a strong relationship about the experiences of violence and the reproduction of violence. So if we know about violence against women, the experiences of domestic violence, then we can have a better assessment of the levels of domestic violence or violence against children. The same thing happens with psychological violence. Again, the highest percentage of women who told us that insulted, yelled their children comes from a woman who witnessed psychological violence and experienced psychological violence. Again, this is not, you can have very severe acts of psychological violence, like threaten somebody, hiding, etc. So these are the last two pictures that I wanted to show you, and this is just briefly the takeaways. There are several things that I think we can discuss here. The first one, or the points that I would like you to take from this conversation. The first one is that violence against women tends to be a phenomenon underreported. So it's very complicated just to rely on administrative records. We need specialized surveys, and specialized surveys needs to comply with ethical and methodological standards. These surveys help for policy goals. The first one, it allows to know the prevalence in types and settings and perpetrators, but also they allow us to understand the help-seeking behavior and the characteristics, the dynamics, and cycles of violence. One problem that we face is that since these surveys are quite expensive, there are very few countries who actually conduct the surveys. And they tend to focus particularly in intimate partner violence or family violence. So it will be great to develop or to conduct more surveys in different countries. But again, it's quite expensive. ENDIREH is one of the few, or Mexico is one of the few countries that guarantee the conduction of these surveys every 5 years. So for that, so I think that we are lucky. And with that, I'm done. Antonella? Thank you.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Alejandra. Sí. Yeah, to make it a little bit more informal. I'm going to stick to my notes because if not, I'm going to talk forever. I find this fascinating and very important, so I'm honored to be giving some comments to the presentation. I think maybe this is obvious, but the first ENDIREH in 2003 and all the subsequent waves, I think, represent a very important triumph of the women's movement in Mexico, considering the intensity of the violence and the delay of the state in diagnosing this problem and implementing solutions to attend this problem. And this is a problem of the region, not particular of Mexico, but I think this is a fantastic opportunity to understand it more, but also a triumph of all these women who mobilized. It should be very obvious that the main reason why a survey like this is so important is because violence against women is still so pervasive in Mexico and in the region. According to data we just saw from INEGI, violence has increased over the last 5 years, and the violence dynamics that I think Alejandra really nicely illustrated with this idea of looking at the different shapes and sizes of the circle suggests that violence is very stable, so it's unlikely to go away. So I think that even if we think about lethal violence, we know that women and girls are assassinated or killed because of their gender in Mexico with a very high frequency. So it's hard to stress enough how valuable this product is. I think it's very important to talk about the costs, but it's really, really, really valuable. So I want to start the comments by pointing to a little bit about the methodological changes that have taken place through the survey ways with respect to the first version that, as I was saying before, was launched in 2003, to then move to some maybe more meta ideas and some of the things that I think this survey does a very good job at detecting and illustrate more concretely why we need this product and what cannot be done with this. So when I was preparing these comments, I started by looking at the questionnaires since 2003, and it came to my attention that the survey changed a little bit. So I will tell you why I think the flexibility of ENDIREH is so important, and it's very useful that they keep adding and working on the questionnaire. But some of the changes that I noticed, for example, the sampling frame changed a little bit to reflect the heterogeneous experiences that women live in Mexico. So violence manifests itself throughout the territory in different ways. The prevalence is very different. It depends not only on the institutional characteristics of the context in which it takes place, but also on the more socio-demographic characteristics. And I think this is very important. The fact that these new spaces were added, so we saw the comparison with 2016, but with respect to previous waves, this inclusion of these new configurations of violence, taking into account violence at the workplace, like departing from this idea that the perpetrator of violence is important to define these domains or these spaces Alejandra was making a reference to. I think it's very important because these changes are mimicking something that is happening in real life, right? So violence is always transforming itself. There are a lot of transformation of household dynamics, new configurations of families that maybe allow for violence to manifest in different ways. And I think thinking about the trends, like the survey reflects, in like simultaneously all these changes are taking place in society, I think it's worth pausing a little bit and thinking about what we are capturing when we implement a survey that measures violence against women. I think that the fact that these two things change at the same time, the prevalence, changes in preferences and behaviors, the levels we are detecting through surveys, presents this kind of epistemological question on how to measure something when we still don't have like a vocabulary to talk about it. I think it's important, like, I'm a little bit pessimistic in this sense, like I don't think gender violence is going away anytime soon, but I do think that violence is transforming, right? And I think that Alejandra's point of asking about specific facts is a very useful way to kind of circumvent some of these more conceptual problems of what are we measuring when we still don't have like a way to talk about certain type of violence is super important, because instead of relying on like the ability or the skills or having a vocabulary to make a reference to the violence, we're able to measure it in a more objective way, if that makes sense. But at the same time, I think that it's important to note that, for example, the capacity to detect that you are the subject of violence is important for whether you recall these facts, how you recall them, how many of those facts you are able to recall, etc. So I think this awareness of what constitutes violence in the society poses this challenging for designing these types of surveys. And I think INEGI does a fantastic job in this, in how capturing like how all these societal changes without sacrificing like the comparability across surveys. And I think maybe this may sound like a trivial point, given that we are thinking about like such damaging experience for women. But I think we often overlook like the fact, maybe not INEGI, but some of us maybe overlooks like the fact that things change so fast hinders our ability to be able to conceptualize, measure, explain, intervene on those things. And I think, for example, if we think about digital violence, that is something that ENDIREH is starting to get involved with. These platforms are not regulated. They change names, they change owners, they change the algorithms, and still are one of the places in the world where you can find the most misogynistic and transphobic content in comparison to anywhere else. But at the same time, these platforms change really, really fast. So I think like this conceptual or like methodological discussion of how to measure this violence kind of underscores this idea that the fact that things change so fast sometimes makes measuring these things really complicated. So I was actually happy to see like this survey has been adapting through time to try to capture these things. A small point that I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I wanted to put out there because I'm sure people will have questions about this, is how to separate this more communitary gendered violence from other violent processes that are taking place in Mexico. I think ENDIREH is useful to some extent to do this, but I think it's a very important question because sometimes gender violence is often overlooked due to like the very high levels of violence that the country is experiencing, particularly in some areas where also like gendered violence is really, really high, and it's important to be able to distinguish those. Moving on to some of the areas where I think this survey could be particularly useful. So maybe this is kind of an unpopular opinion, I don't know, let's see. But I think the fact that sometimes like our graduate training pushes us to think too much about identification and causal explanations and policy implementation and etc. But I think that we don't worry about description enough. This survey is so rich, it's incredible. Like the sample size is insane. So I believe like we really need to be doing a lot of descriptive work with these types of surveys to intervene. Like I do causally identified work, is the only work I do. But I really think that to be able to make that work, we really need a good diagnosis of where to intervene, which are the areas that we need to be paying attention to, and we need to know about adolescent marriage, child marriage, offline social networks. So I think the last part of the discussion was super interesting because a lot of the evidence that we have from people who have been studying how to prevent gender violence and use this as an input suggests that social networks, offline social networks, so connections to people who you can seek to help are fundamental. It's like the most important thing. So for example, there is this intervention in Peru where we see women becoming more economically independent, but the main thing that is leading them to make criminal complaints against the perpetrators of violence is the ability to rely on this offline social network. So I think being able to measure these things and thinking about new creative ways in which we can measure like reliance on individuals outside the household is super important to try to advance knowledge in this area. The survey is super, super rich, but we can get a lot of really good evidence on the prevalence of different types of violence that are very important, obstetric violence, know more about the emotional and physical health of the victims of violence. So before I want to open the floor for questions, but maybe two of the questions I had to kick off maybe the discussion or the Q&A is, I mean, the first one has to do with these measures of violence as being like lower bounds in a sense. Like even though the ENDIREH is implemented in a way in which it tries to maximize like privacy, to elicit honest responses, a lot of time people are like afraid of talking about these experiences. So I wanted to know if you're thinking about how to put bounds to this estimate in a way, like how for like we know administrative data underestimates this prevalence. I wanted to know, like, do you believe like maybe this is a similar case? Like we are able to measure it more accurately, but it would be possible to estimate like maybe through list experiments or something of the sort, a way to elicit more honest responses? Or, I mean, I know like INEGI is a very it has a very good reputation, and ENDIREH is implementing in such a careful way that you would think, okay, so we are actually eliciting these honest responses. But I wanted to know how you're thinking about that. And the other thing is something that we were talking about during lunch is, so the level of transphobic violence in Mexico is super high, and maybe it's not fair to ask of a survey that's doing such an amazing work, having this representativity at the state level, like the sampling frame to detect, to have like enough statistical power to detect this phenomena at the local level or even at the national level would be completely different. But we have like this gender diversity survey, so it's something that you are thinking about, like, is it possible, considering like the difference in the sample frame that you would need to detect this type of violence, that it's also like super high in Mexico, at least that is the perception of the information that I see. But thank you, Alejandra.
¿Voy a participar?
So thank you for your speeches. I would like to know, considering the design of the questionnaire, how to do the same questions to so different women in the country, talking about level of instruction and rural, urban, how to design a question that can be understood by so many different kind of women, no? How to deal with that. And the second one is, have you done something about the result of this last survey about the COVID effects on violence? Because the greatest thing between the previous one and this one has been the COVID, that is known that has increased the level of violence, especially at home. Thank you.
Well, I will try to answer your two questions and Marta's questions, because your questions and some of the points that you raised are basic concerns. I wanted to speak particularly on one that I know is of your interest. When we were working on the update of the questionnaire, we were quite concerned of having, something to measure the influence of criminal violence, organized crime. And one way to do it, that we thought about it, because it's not that I sit with myself just to think how to do it, but no, we have several sessions with experts, and also we have a public consultation. And one way, because it's a long questionnaire, it's quite long questionnaire. So one way is that whether or not you were threatened or attacked by gun, by knife, to distinguish the weapon. But there are way too many considerations to do that. So, and then we have a longer discussion how to improve the questionnaire, and for that we needed to conduct a pilot. So we didn't have enough time to conduct a pilot, so that's why we did not change the question. But at ENDIREH, there are at least for me, in my area, we are in charge of the conceptual development of this survey. But at least for my team and for the Directorate of Government Statistics, there are 4 points of specific concern that we are planning to work for the next edition. The first one is how to identify the influence of criminal and gang violence. Because, as you may know, sexual violence is more often than not an instrument of control when you have criminal organized crime. The second one is how can we better capture the violence that older women face, because it's not the same. And again, it's something that because of socio-demographic changes, we need to start thinking about just to have a baseline on that. The third one is how can we approach or have a better approach to disability? In this way, we have a better assessment of disability, but we need to understand better disability and physical limitations. And of course, the last one is the technological facilitated gender-based violence. So it's something that we have. It's something that we couldn't include because to design the survey, to think about the questions, we usually conduct pilots. Now, if you see the questionnaire, the questions are very straightforward. Really is, have you been kicked? Have you been insulted? Have you been, is nothing, or the questions are phrased in such a way that we avoid the need of the woman to make inferences about what we are asking. They are very straightforward. So, for instance, the problem could be, and this is a question, an open question, when we go to indigenous communities, because it may be that some of the words or the question may have a different reference, but not really when we are talking about the acts. This is one of the most important characteristics of the surveys, of this survey. Is when I speak about acts, what I'm referring to is actions of violence. So indigenous communities may have a different perception when we are asking about gender roles, no? But it's going to be complicated when we ask about specific acts of violence. They may not think that being insulted, jailed, whatever is violence, but I'm not asking whether or not they think that it is violence. I'm asking only if they live the act. So that's why every time that we change a little bit of the questions, we try to conduct cognitive pilots or an open or more general pilot. The second is COVID. COVID, or the emergency, as I said, this survey was conducted October, November 2021. As you remember, in Mexico, we have different decisions at the state level. We have this, how they call it, this, every state have a different color. They develop this the semáforo, sanitario, whatever. So we were really hoping to have an open situation in all the states. Thankfully, during October and November, we were yellow in most of the states. So COVID didn't impact the level of response. We have one of the highest response rates in this survey. We were very proud of the team of interviewers because we reached something around 90% of complete surveys, which 96% of privacy. So it was a success. Now, in the questionnaire, because we conduct this survey in October, and we were asking before the 12 months before, that means October 2020 to October 2021. As you remember, the emergency started in March of 2021. So that was a terrible methodological situation because we were covering the 12-month period in which half of them was during the emergency and half of it was outside the emergency. So we included 2 questions in which we asked not prevalence, not acts, but perceptions. And the questions were something like, do you consider that the problems within the family increases, decreases, or remain the same after March of 2020, which was declared liquid? So, and we asked the same question with problems with the intimate partner. And the responses were something like 8-point-something% of the women consider that the problems increases with the partner or with the family. I remember it was something around 10%. Around 5% consider it decreases, and the rest thought it remained the same. So it was the only way that we were able to approach the impact of COVID. We thought a lot about asking for prevalences, but imagine the problem. So Guanajuato was maybe close everything at some point, but it was different in Tamaulipas. So it was different in the state of Mexico. It was different in Chiapas. So we didn't have a specific point of reference in time just to have a standardized question. So we really suffered to try to, and we now thought about whether or not to ask for specific acts, but if we didn't have enough information by the time that we developed the questionnaire, because when we closed the design of the questionnaire, COVID was not on the agenda. We closed the design of the questionnaire, I think it was late September, November of 2020. So we were expecting, because we were told so, that the emergency would last, no? 3 months. And it was crazy because, so it was a complicated situation. But at least those 2 questions help us to understand at least the perception of the problems. So I don't know if that more or less answered the question. And okay, I think that's it. Cecilia.
Thank you. I want to echo what Antonella said about the need for more descriptive work. Absolutely, yes, and thanks to INEGI for facilitating that process. I have two specific questions about, one, if you have a protocol for cases where in the course of doing the interview, the woman asks for help from INEGI, especially considering the high levels of trust that INEGI has, if you have, what happens in those instances. And also, you've mentioned several times that your questionnaire is very long, and so I'm also wondering what strategies do you follow to avoid respondent fatigue? Thank you.
Well, I will answer that one. The questionnaire is very long if you are a woman who has different or several types of victimization. If you're a woman who only face victimization at the workspace, then you go through really fast for the rest of the questionnaire. So the training of the interviewers is also is organized so you can help the woman to share the experiences, and it's not only about the time it takes to conduct the interview. For some women, for instance, it could be so difficult that they need time, keep quiet, or ask you to come back later, or ask you to wait a minute, or they go to drink water or whatever. So the train is just to be patient. And if they request to conduct the interview to stop and come back the next day, they have to come back the next day. So it's a very hard work for interviewers because they have to be there whenever the woman is able or willing to speak. So that's what I can say about the responding fatigue. Regarding the protocols, this is an international debate as well, because it is not easy to have a general decision. If you are in general, interviewers do not intervene. So if I am interviewing Antonella, and Antonella explained to me and shares with me a complicated experience, and she asks for my help, what I can do, and actually every interview does is just to provide Antonella with the information of the institutions to which she can approach to request assistance or to file a complaint. So the last thing that we do before starting the survey, when I say the last thing is actually the last thing, 15 minutes before we start, is just to be sure that we have an updated directory of this institution. So I interview Antonella. If she tells me an act of violence, I gave her a little card. You cannot tell what is inside of this little card with all this information, regardless if Antonella tells me about an act of violence or not. If I interview her, I give it to her, period. So this is the way that we intervene. In other countries, for instance, the Argentinian case, what they did was just to make an agreement with police, I guess, in which if they have something to report, they call, report, and then the police respond. This is debatable, because if I do that, suppose that INEGI were able to do that. Antonella is telling me that her husband beats her over and over again, and she asks me for help, and maybe I call the police so they come and help Antonella. What if they come whenever the husband is present, and then Antonella doesn't leave, and then the next day Antonella is really beaten badly? So it's not. It seems easy. It's not easy. And part of the training that the interviewers receive is what to do with this feeling or with this need of being helpful, because sometimes you have to even keep distance, because you don't know how you can react. For some women, it's like, how is it possible, Antonella, that you allow your husband to beat you? No, Antonella, do something about it. No, that could be one reaction. The other reaction could be, Antonella, no, come with me, and then you take a lot of responsibility. So what we do in the training is to help the interviewers just to recognize those symptoms or those emotions and to speak about them. For that, the way out of that situation is to provide the information. We cannot do more in the case of INEGI. But again, it's a debate, an international debate, how to react in those situations. And I just close this comment with this. It's different, and it's an ethical debate, even more acute when the violence is against children. When you're interviewing a girl from 15 to 17 years old, and she's telling you that, for instance, she faced rape or something like that, may be different because you may be forced or obliged to report that to the police. Again, is at the international level, there is no a guideline, a general guideline for that.
Gracias. ¿Puedes expresar en español? Tengo un par de preguntas. Una es justamente sobre entiendo que la encuesta entrevista a mujeres a partir de 15 años. Entonces, ¿cuáles son los procedimientos éticos, sobre todo cuando los agresores pueden ser su madre o su padre, ¿no? Y hay otra cosa que me interesa, que es el soporte institucional que se provee a los entrevistadores. Tuve la oportunidad de ver los resultados de la encuesta del 2016 y se reporta pues agresiones contra las entrevistadoras, ¿no? Entonces creo que eso me interesa un poco. No sé si lo recuerdo bien, pero me parecía que sí. Y hay otro tema que es, de acuerdo a lo que a mí me interesa, es la violencia ginecobstétrica a población transmasculina, que es difícil de captar y que recientemente pues yo me lo he encontrado en varias situaciones de estudio, que no sé cómo entraría, digamos, en este paraguas.
The first question was about, we didn't have any report of important incidents against interviewers in the 2021. And that's one thing. The second is INEGI has state level teams that usually work along with these interviewers. For ENDIREH, we have a huge team. Besides those 1,312 interviewers, we have something like 70, 80 personnel who are a higher level, different training, that are the ones who support and provide guidance to the interviewers. And above that level is like the central team. So, but we didn't have a report of specific violent incidents against interviewers in 2021. 2016, that I don't know, to be honest, but we can check. We have a whole, program just to protect interviewers. And also, as Graciela was, this is another of the challenges of the ENDIREH. Graciela was explaining yesterday that we tend to hire people from the local communities. For ENDIREH, no, because I cannot hire my neighbor just to conduct interviews about violence in the same community, because if I'm going, then I'm going. So that's another challenge. But usually are people from the state, so they know they know the space. Indeed, we rely a lot between. It's not that we rely, but personnel who tend to be hired for INEGI is personnel who tend to be hired at INEGI, because they know very well the state level dynamics, so they go back and forth. For ENDIREH, for this wave, we hire a lot of interviewers that have experience in the 2016. Now, regarding the other question, which was the obstetric violence for male transgender, it's difficult because male transgender is a very small size of population that even with this sample size, we cannot capture completely. So the obstetric violence section at ENDIREH covers all women who have a child or who were pregnant and went through delivery or cesarean in the previous 5 years. So male transgender, it's difficult to be in that group. So we don't capture obstetric violence against, for instance, women who did not deliver or have a C-section during the 5 previous years of the interview. So that is part of why. Now, consider that ENDIREH, again, is quite a long questionnaire, as I said. So that's why every single question that we want to introduce, we need to be very careful about introducing the question. But that is the reason why we don't capture that information. We can capture some information about violence, intimate partner violence against same-sex couples. But it's not enough, the number, just to make national inferences. But it can provide a guide of what is going on. Indeed, intimate partner violence in same-sex couples is understudied, deeply understudied.
Well, my question has more to do with the data collection process also, like this interviewing process. How much of problem might it represent when, well, you were mentioning that when somebody says maybe yes to having punched or being kicked, it might lead to more questions, right, about that specific situation, even it is more concrete questions. How much of a problem it might represent for the data collection process when somebody's talking about a problem and they refuse to continue giving some information about that specific topic? Does it represent a problem about the data you're recollecting about that specific problem and we cannot add it, or we can just add this percentage of information, or we cannot process this? Basically the question is how much of a challenge does it represent this kind of refusals to participate, mostly in these very complicated and sensible topics?
In general, there is not a problem. The questionnaire allows you to say, I don't want to respond. And you can see, I don't have the data for each one in my mind. I have too many numbers and you don't want me to go through all those. But it's a very small number. Yeah. So again, that's why the training is so important. Because if you speak about an experience of violence, maybe I provide you with some time so you can think about what you are planning to tell me, whatever. But it's not really, it's not, you have women who say, I don't want to keep talking about it, but it's not such a high number that compromises the information. And you can identify. And it would be nice to know which questions, which acts, and everything. So you have a thesis topic over there.
And even if you got this type of results, you can still use the data provided before?
Yes, yes. Because the questionnaire is designed in such a way that I can partition the moments of the information. So whether or not you experience violence, check. No? What did you do about that violence? Did you tell somebody? Check. No? Or to whom you tell to? Then did you request assistance? Did you file a complaint? So I can partition the four. Zero.
Thank you. I want to know about the level of disaggregation of the survey, because I think it's interesting, as Antonella was saying, about the relationship and the nets that are able to the women to find a way to the news or something like that. The other surveys of INEGI, like ENCUSI, the National Survey of Civic Culture, has information about the participation in social networks and in another way, for example, the ENDIREH has information about the marginalization, social indicators, and maybe you can see in a very local level the difference with the results of this survey and the context of poverty, inequality, and degree of organization and social networks is what level is possible to do that with other surveys.
So even though it's a huge sample size, and it's really huge, it's 100,047 households, the level of representativeness is state level. So you cannot make inferences at the municipal level. The point is that we have the ENDIREH, it has two questionnaires. The socio-demographic questionnaire, in which you have the general socio-demographic variables. For that, you can make inferences of whether or not having different levels, for instance, of income, or being rural, urban, or having some levels of education. In other words, you can frame it so you can infer or correlate levels of marginalization or levels of income with correlation with types of violence, spaces of violence, whatever. So the socio-demographic is it's a very comprehensive socio-demographic questionnaire. Then you have a questionnaire that we implement depending on the marital status of the woman. That's why if you go through the webpage, which by the way, I almost forgot to tell, that this is one of the few surveys, we have an English version of the survey, of all the questionnaires, and also the main results, and also a brief booklet of the main results. But well, the point is that after that socio-demographic, you have equivalent questionnaires depending on the marital status. But the socio-demographic questionnaire is very comprehensive, and then you can make inferences. But we stop at the state level. And again, it's 147,000. That's why when they say, but we need information at the municipal level, it's like, yes, we also want that, but then it could be like, it's the most expensive survey. It was more than 100, help me, Julieta, like 120 something or 146 million of pesos. It was lost.
Hi, hello, thank you. My name is Hector. I'm here doing my master in public policy right here in GPS. Yes, these questions pop up just because she asking about transgender people suffering violence, but also the presentation you gave it to us, thank you. It's facing only the two biological sexes, the man and the male and the woman. But I'm just thinking if you have information about violence, in women receiving by the same sex, woman, lesbian, transgender, trans male, etc. Because it's important, even for responders, if the police came out to a violence report, it's not the same way if a police woman respond to the incident that a police man, or the Ministerio Público, it's a woman or man, or also men suffer different sentences if it's a police girl or policeman or a judge, man or girl. Men, it's forced to pay more alimony or child support, or pay higher sentences in prison, different if a woman commit the violence against women. I don't know if you have that kind of data, because you said this is just partial of that you present to us, but I don't know if you have it in ENDIREH. Thank you.
Well, two answers to that. At ENDIREH, you are right, we also cover information. We ask about sex at birth. We do not ask about gender identity or sexual orientation. However, there is one question in which we can't have information about the sex of the partner. So in that regard, we are able to have information on same-sex couples at ENDIREH, but it's very, very, very small, the number of same-sex couples. So it's so small that maybe you can have national level inferences for some variables, but not for all of them, because it's very, very small. I think it's something around 10% of the sample. Now, you are right, this is something that we have to consider, but as you will see in tomorrow or the next day, Julieta will be talking about the gender diversity survey. I always forget the name, and the national sexual, that's it, sexual orientation and gender diversity. And I'm sure that Julieta will explain the quite methodological challenges just to conduct these questions. I'm just going to give you an anecdote of the National Survey on Civic Culture, which was conducted before the survey on gender and identity. And the very last question of that survey was about gender identity and sexual orientation. And it was very difficult to ask the question in our sample, because you were at the rural areas with interviewing somebody of 70 years old, and at the same time in the center of Mexico City interviewing somebody with 20 years old. The understanding of the concepts between the two groups is quite different. So that question, for instance, was not the best resource just to analyze gender identity. So again, it's an international debate. So we have been discussing about how to approach gender identity, sexual orientation at ENDIREH, but that may imply to extend a little bit, or not a little bit, to extend the questionnaire. So that's why for this previous edition, we didn't include those questions. It's just, you're right, about just sex at birth. But we do not discriminate. In other words, if somebody opens the door and we ask, we need to speak with a woman of 50 years older, and no, say yes, of course, yeah, it's okay. Yeah. And for instance, since it is very complicated just to gather information about identity, etc., so I'm sure Julieta is going to explain this, but the ENDIREH has a section of violence. So one approach could be just to include in other webs of ENDIREH the specific questions of intimate partner violence and what they have been going through in this type of violence in same-sex couples. That could be a way to analyze it. Julieta, you have a question already. No? Another question? If not, I'm happy to talk after this conversation, and also please check the webpage. We did a lot of work just to have this questionnaire translated, so please use it. And also we send this translation to some colleagues from Europe and the US, so it's double check. So you are safe if you use that survey and the outcome. So thank you very much, all of you, for your time and your patience, and thank you, Antonella, for your comments. So have a good afternoon.